Hi, I'm Metta Spencer. Today we're going to talk about some very important matters that I've been neglecting a little bit in the last year or two, and that is the threat of nuclear weapons. I don't know why I've been so interested, I guess, in climate change that I've sort of left behind my lifelong or almost lifelong preoccupation. So let's get back to work on one of the huge threats facing humankind and some of the things that are being done to try to overcome it. First, let me go to Princeton, where I'd like to introduce Stuart Prager, who is a physicist working in some astronomical field department or something. He can explain that if he wants to. And he has founded, along with some other people, a new organization called a Physicists Coalition for Nuclear Threat Reduction. And that's what we want to talk about, because it's high time we get more people involved with the effort to try to reduce what is apparently a very serious now nuclear weapons threat. And I want to also introduce now, let's go to Vancouver and meet Ruhi Dalal. And Ruhi is I shouldn't try to introduce her exactly because she already knows Stuart, and they've worked together. I think she was probably a graduate student working. Let her explain it. But she's an astronomer, and she's working on space security and space sustainability nowadays, which is a little different angle for an astronomer. She's a postdoctoral fellow at the Outer Space Institute in Vancouver, right? Welcome, Ruhi. Nice to meet you. Okay. Now I'm going to switch back to talking first with Stuart, because that's really what I want to explore, that he and his colleagues at, I guess, mostly Princeton, have created a new coalition, which I presume is intended to expand way beyond Princeton and include physicists, including a physicist slash astronomer named Ruhi. So tell me, Stuart, how did all this come about, and why are you doing it now rather than 40 years ago?
Well, first I'll tell you how it came about. It's a little bit consistent with there's a cliche, think globally, act locally.
Mm-hmm.
You know, you have a global air pollution problem, you try to clean up the air in your neighborhood and your zip code. But for physicists, our local community is not our zip code, it's the physics community. And physicists have a special relationship to nuclear weapons. We played a role in inventing them. We play a current role in maintaining and evolving them. And maybe most importantly, in the eyes of the public, we're associated with nuclear weapons. Mm-hmm. So we decided, three of us at Princeton, Frank von Hippel, Zia Mian, and me, and decided to organize a physics community. So we decided to start a new organization 4 years ago with the dual purpose of, one, alerting and educating the physics community to the current danger, which, as you well know and mentioned, is increasing. Mm-hmm. But most importantly, to mobilize the physics community to function as advocates for steps to reduce the threat from nuclear weapons. And the thought is that if physicists can speak on this issue, their voice will have maybe more impact than the voice of some other sector of the country, you know, such as insurance agents. Insurance agents speak about nuclear weapons that may have less impact than physicists speaking about it. So we got started up we were fortunate that we were started up by the American Physical Society, which in the United States is this professional national society for physicists. And by them, by starting under their umbrella, it gave us kind of a legitimacy for the start. We have that was a startup. We're now partnered with a non-government organization in the United States called the Arms Control Association.
Mhm.
What we do is it's a very much a grassroots organization. We go out to where physicists are. So we have a team of physicists of 15 physicists who have expertise in nuclear weapons issues. And we go out to physics departments at universities. We've gone out to nuclear engineering departments, and we've gone out to some national laboratories. In all, we visited 150 uh, physics sites spread all over the United States.
Wow.
During COVID, it was virtual. Now it's mostly in person. We also have webinars, newsletter, and in this process, we've recruited about 1,500 physicists to join our coalition, which, as you said, is called the Physicists Coalition for Nuclear Threat Reduction. And
Mhm.
we don't want a membership just to send newsletter to. We want a membership of advocates.
Mhm.
And so, in the U.S., if you have a few hundred people that convey in an organized way a unified message to Congress, it can have an effect. So that's the principle. And so we're 4 years in and we're operating. We also try to reach out to recruit early career scientists. So we have a fellowship program where Ruhi was one of them. We're happy to say she passed through that. Um, Now that we're operating, standing and operating nationally, we're trying to reach out internationally, which we can get into. There's lots of challenges there. We had a workshop in Italy last October where we had people from about 20 different nations, 50 physicists trying to have an international dialogue among the physics community, currently absent. And another thing we're doing, which we can maybe get into later, is more inward looking. We're trying to just beginning now to try to catalyze a discussion in the physics community about the ethics of physicists working on nuclear weapons,
Wow.
which many physicists do within a program in the U.S. called the Stockpile Stewardship Program. So there are many different threads to this coalition. The core is just having a network of physicist advocates as citizens to advocate for steps to make us safer. But then there are all these other threads, reaching out internationally, the ethics, and so on. So in a nutshell, here we are.
Now, the first question that occurs to me is, how does it go when you go out and talk to sort of a cold call? In other words, you haven't prepped people to know exactly what you're going to deal with, and you approach them and ask them to join you, and they are physicists. Take the average physicist. There is no such thing, but a lot of physicists work on weapons, on nuclear issues for the government, and other people work in industries that are closely integrated with military uses. So I wonder what percentage of the people say, yes, I'd love to join your outfit, or no, I think you're misguided and we need our weapons. Thank you.
Well, about 9% of the audience to which we present a colloquium will join the coalition, roughly speaking. And people that do this kind of thing say that's pretty good. Now, in terms of the general response, though, the average physicist is, of course, aware of nuclear weapons threat and can understand the physics, but hasn't thought about it, is much like the average member of the general public. Since the end of the Cold War, it's gone off of the radar of the general public. And so the average physicist really doesn't think about it much and is complacent about it. And what we have found is that, and this is anecdotal, but I think it's quite general and valid, when we make a presentation to a university or even to a national science laboratory, we get a strong resonance. I was expecting we would get some hecklers. I mean, that is people who would raise their hand and say, I disagree with your perspective. Nuclear weapons are essential tools. They've kept us safe. And of course, there are people that believe that, but we haven't had much of that response at all.
Even from the people whose livelihood depends on doing that work.
I wouldn't go that far.
Oh, okay.
What I would say is to the average, the majority of physicists who are majority of physicists don't work on nuclear weapons.
Yeah.
physicists are important, very important to the nuclear weapons complex. And in the United States, they're coalesced mainly in two laboratories, the Los Alamos National Laboratory and the Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory. But the vast majority of physicists don't work directly on nuclear weapons. And they tend to, you just give them the facts and they resonate with it and are not in opposition to the message that these are horrible things and their salience need to be reduced. I'll go a little further, and this is even more anecdotal. I think a lot of the physicists that work in the nuclear weapons complex, for example, I know you've heard about the National Ignition Facility at Livermore Lab, where they had some highly publicized results relevant to fusion energy lately.
Actually, we did a forum with Frank von Hippel and I think who else was it? I can't remember. He was certainly the main person about that.
Right.
Yeah.
Right, I watched that.
Did you?
Good. And most of those physicists are not so much ideologues on nuclear weapons. I think they're mostly motivated by the really fascinating science that comes out of those experiments and the fusion energy application. But this is this discussion. We want to have a significant and direct discussion with physicists who are working on experiments that are completely funded for nuclear weapons, and we haven't had that discussion yet.
You can't reach those people easily, or can you? Do you have a whole list of people that you know are working on the forces of evil that you want to contact?
I don't. Yes, I wouldn't say I have a whole list. I don't have I don't have a list, but yes, we know people who work in those experiments. Some of them are sort of our professional colleagues, and there's nothing secret there. That's not secret. Working on National Ignition Facility, when they publish openly some of their results, not all of it. They do publish the unclassified portion of their results, and they'll have hundreds of physicists working on it, and those names are known, no secret.
Yes.
So we can
for 35 years, I was very engaged with an organization called Science for Peace, which was founded at the University of Toronto primarily by Eric Fawcett, who was a physicist, and he got a handful of his physics colleagues and people in other departments as well to join as a group of scientists. I think he made a mistake because he let me in, and then that was opening the wrong floodgate, because a bunch of other people who were not at all scientists. I'm a sociologist. A lot of other scientists also wanted in, but the point that I want to make in this comment is that Eric was bitterly disappointed in the long run because he could not recruit more than maybe three or four other scientists in general. Now, not just physicists, but he could not get people to be engaged with that organization if they were real scientists. And I don't think it was just because they let in people like me. I think it was that these folks were simply, I don't know, indifferent or something. But in other words, you say you get 9%, and I wanted that number because I don't think he ever got anything like 9%. What is your impression about that?
Well, I think yes, we struggle with that also. Most physicists are 110% involved in their physics. They don't have any time for anything else. And that's also a little bit, I don't mean this critically, it's the culture of physics. That's your calling, and you don't focus your mind in other things. I think we've had this amount joining because of going out there in person. And we go out there in person, we'll give a colloquium, and then we'll also have discussions. So we'll meet with grad students and have in-depth discussions, ideally with people throughout the day. So I think it's the grassroots outreaching nature of it that has allowed us to accumulate the 1,500.
If I could chime in here, I also think the culture in physics is starting to change, especially, as someone who just finished grad school in physics. I think there's increasing interest and appetite among early career physicists to think about the kind of broader policy issues and ethical implications of the kinds of work we're doing. I see that more and more among both undergraduate and graduate physics students. And I think the Physicists Coalition, especially through the fellowships that it offers for early career physicists, is a way to be engaged and think about the broader context of the work that you're doing. And I think there's slowly some change where that's becoming both more desired and acceptable in the field, as opposed to just doing your physics research.
That's really wonderful to know. Now, tell me a little bit about the fellowship that you had. You say the coalition offered it wasn't a fellowship, but some sort of program for early career physicists, and you were one of them. Is that right?
Yeah, it's called the Next Generation.
What did you do as in that role?
Yeah, so it's called the Next Generation Fellowship. I think applications for it will actually open in the next few months, probably in November or December. Mm-hmm. And through that, you get paired with sort of a mentor. So I worked with Alex Glaser at Princeton, as well as Tong Zhao and Igor Morich, who are also at Princeton. And you work together to find a project. Usually that's something that kind of bridges, or it can be something that bridges some of the research you've done with nuclear threats issues. It could also be something very different, like a more policy-oriented project, and writing an op-ed or something like that. But you spend the year both researching potential topics, developing a project, and then executing it. And then the Physicists Coalition also provides a lot of career development opportunities. So every fall in October, there's the School on Science and Global Security. So they provide funding to attend that. There's also, funding for other conferences. I was able to attend in April the DC Engagement Days, where we sort of did congressional office visits to talk about particular nuclear weapons issues that we were hoping to get co-sponsors on resolutions and things. And so,
wait a minute, elaborate on that.
So that in particular was focused on a few different issues. Sort of the main issue we were focusing on was the Sentinel program. So this is a program to update the US land-based ICBMs and replace the Minuteman missiles with Sentinel missiles. And it's an incredibly expensive program. It's forecasted to cost over $400 billion.
This is a U.S. Is this part of the whole thing about they don't call it renewal, but it's something like sprucing up our nuclear arsenal? Is that the general? Yes. It came a few years ago, modernizing it. They were going to modernize the nuclear arsenal in the U.S. and the Sentinel program would be part of that.
Right. And so there were huge cost overruns associated with the project. And it ended up to the point where it was in violation of something called the Nunn-McCurdy Act, which is when defense spending basically goes way over budget. And so it had to be reviewed by Congress and reapproved, given those cost overruns. And so we took
Now, when did this thing start, and how long did they take to figure out that they were spending too much?
It started probably 5 or 6 years ago. I don't know the exact timeline when they started the modernization program and specifically the Sentinel program. But it was this congressional review was triggered by a certain percentage over budget. I think they ended up going close to 50% over budget. And that's what triggered this official congressional review.
Okay. Now that is a recent thing, because I don't know about that review.
Yes, it was just this summer.
Program. So,
Um,
I mean, offhand, I would just immediately be opposed to it on principle. But is there any special, I mean, what arguments do you present if you want to argue against it and say this is either not worth the money in the first place, and it's a bad idea in the second place?
right. So we had a few different arguments. One is that it's just incredibly expensive and it's continuing to go increasingly over budget. But beyond that, these ICBMs, land-based ICBMs, are in fixed positions across the US in silos, and they're considered a sponge for other countries' nuclear arsenals. So other countries would target these ICBMs, and so they'd end up using up their nuclear arsenals trying to target all of these land-based missiles. But what that argument ignores is the fact that it means that large parts of the US are being struck by other countries' nuclear missiles under that strategy. And the fallout from those attacks would affect almost every part of the US. Mm-hmm. There's also the question of why it's even necessary when we have submarine launched missiles that are survivable. They are going to survive any first nuclear attack. And so why do we need the addition of the land-based ICBMs? One or two submarine launched missiles should be enough to deter any country. Mm-hmm. And so it kind of comes down
to your position, which I believe is probably the main one, is that the last thing you would probably want to disarm, if you really succeeded in disarming, would be submarine missiles, right?
They would be very difficult to disarm. They would be difficult to attack because they can't be tracked.
Right. Okay. Okay. Well, now this argument, certainly you don't have any trouble convincing me, but how far did that second argument about the deleterious side effects or the negative consequences of having such weapons, how far did that go when you were trying to lobby people in Congress? Have any of them bought into a really disarmament issue point of view?
So there is at least a few. And I will say, so the research on that was done by Sebastian Philipp at Princeton. So he's published maps showing for different scenarios what the fallout would look like, what areas would be affected. And I would definitely recommend taking a look at those. I think we certainly had some interest, and there are members of Congress who have championed this issue. So Congressman John Garamendi, for example, was the one who organized a hearing on this Sentinel issue. There's Senators Merkley and Markey.
Markey has been in the camp of the angels for 40 years or more, hasn't he?
Yeah. Senator Elizabeth Warren. There are some members of Congress who do really understand and support these same goals, but there is an incredible amount of funding that gets put into lobbying by the people who are building these silos, these missiles, and ultimately the Sentinel program was approved to continue despite all of these arguments against it.
Yeah, maybe I could just add a point that was great. Another argument is that since their locations are known for the land-based ICBMs, they're targetable by an adversary, and therefore the U.S. keeps them on alert status. That is, all 400 ICBMs are alert status. They can be launched literally within minutes of receiving an order. And that really increases the nuclear tension and the danger, because it it also then leads to the U.S. to have an option of launch on warning. So if the U.S. gets a warning, that could be an incorrect one, could be a false alarm, and there have been many, but if it gets a warning that there are weapons from Russia en route, it pressures the president to have just minutes to decide whether to launch these nuclear weapons. So it really adds a tremendous danger of really accidental launch of nuclear weapons.
Let's talk about that. My memory is that I believe it was before he was elected, Biden was speculating in public or pontificating or something about the possibility of going to no first use, taking a declarative position that the United States would never be the first to use nuclear weapon. It would be only if some weapons are coming at them. Now that, of course, would I presume preclude the whole launch on warning scenario. But he never carried through with that. Can you did you feed into that debate, or was there even really a debate about it? Was it simply that the defense establishment came down hard on him and said we can't tolerate that? What went wrong when Biden looked like for a minute he might take that position?
Yeah, see that position, and also he articulated before he was in office that he would be in favor of eliminating the sole authority of the president to launch nuclear weapons.
Mm-hmm.
Right now the president single-handedly can give the order, need no obligation to consult anybody to get anybody's approval. So it's the most anti-democratic thing I think imaginable. President could. And both of those have gone nowhere, as you well know, and I'm not inside government enough to give a insightful answer to your question of what went wrong, but I think it's been shown, we've observed repeatedly that presidents come into office, Obama and others, kind of appalled at the power they have and the lethality of this, but then little happens in these particularly in these declarative policies that you're referring to. And yeah, I think they get beaten down by the Defense Department, by the Pentagon, and by the overall defense establishment that has a point of view of keeping all options on the table. Right? There's an all options on the table perspective that you take any option off the table and it just weakens the United States. Is that point of view? So this has been the experience. What happens?
Well, of course, we've had our political conventions recently, both Republicans and Democrats. As far as I know, there was no mention of any of that. The whole debate, there is no such debate now going on in political parties. Now, if you look at the history of polls for many years globally, I once tried to tabulate all the polls I could get hold of, and as I recall, over a 40-year period, there were a number of polls in different countries asking about whether people believe in getting rid of nuclear weapons. And a majority of people in every poll, except for two, as I recall, said they believe, these are voters, I presume, the citizens of all these different countries, like 20 different countries at least were in the list. The majority of people said they would like to get rid of nuclear weapons, with the exception of one time in Israel and another time in Pakistan. And I don't know whether those opinions would hold up over time. I'm only talking about one poll at a time. But if the majority of people in the world seem to want to get rid of nuclear weapons, and a lot of them live in democracies, why isn't democracy working? Because theoretically, the will of the people should be reflected politically, but it sure is not.
Oh, you're exactly right. I think there's a latent, unactuated, not activated interest in the public, and it could be activated. But Ruhi touched upon it. There's a couple of parts of the problem, and I know as a sociologist, you have more aware of this than I am. One is the lobbying. There's almost 70 billion spent on nuclear weapons in the United States. A lot of it goes to industry. That buys, I think, well over $100 million a year in lobbying. That's more than the funding for the entire nuclear arms control community in the United States, that does research, information dissemination, everything. So we're way, 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 way out resourced, and we're losing. Those that want to decrease the science of nuclear weapons are losing the debate. And I think there's an opportunity because of these polls that you indicate. And also a second factor is nuclear weapons are out of sight, out of mind. So people just don't think about it. And they also think there's nothing they can do. And they also think that it's a complicated issue and there's some nuclear priesthood of experts that are taking care of things. And that's all false. There's no nuclear priesthood of experts. In the United States, we have the most, to my knowledge, we have the most active nuclear arms control disarmament community in the world. Particularly in the 9 nuclear weapon states. We can go through each country, but for different reasons, the United States has the strongest NGO advocacy community, but we're failing tremendously because each NGO is short of money. As they're short of money, they have to focus on keeping their own organization alive. They do great work. I have enormous admiration I'm a relative newcomer to this field, only been in 5 years, enormous admiration for people in these NGOs and universities that advocate, but they're way under-resourced. And this is my own opinion, is what the community in the United States needs right now is to step back and ask themselves the question, if we weren't limited by money and we're only limited by our ideas, what would we do? What could be done? If we had all the money we needed, is there a pathway to using our democracy to make a transformative change? And one reason I'm motivated to say that, in the physics community, we do exactly that. The physics community, when you read about the big science projects, the big accelerators, the big results, more often than not, they're a result of a unified community strategic planning process where the community comes together as a process for rubinosis for a couple of years, and gets on the same page, and then comes out with a common vision, and that leads to change. And since this happened, I think maybe spontaneously, last month in the 1980s with the nuclear freeze movement, but since then it hasn't happened to my knowledge. So I think the nuclear arms control advocacy community needs to challenge itself differently than it's doing, to take advantage of just what you say, that these surveys indicate there's potential there.
I think we ought to have a conference, and only one representative from each NGO is invited to come and talk about how to network better so that the whole nest of disarmers should have some greater impact than they do individually as separate NGOs. I would love to be helping in that kind of activity, or even having people post things on a website, a common website where everybody goes to. I have a website which I'd love to make available to anybody who wants to post stuff like your coalition. If you have webinars or things like that, we could do that. Anyway, let's talk about that later, but I interrupted Ruhi, who was also burning with desire to speak.
That's okay. I think that is a fantastic idea, and I think greater coordination would be really valuable. And I will just say that I think some of the space security community, I think, also has a lot to contribute there, and should, I think nuclear and space security are inherently very, very closely connected as we continue to increasingly rely on space-based capabilities.
Let me ask you about that, because there is this thing called the Outer Space Treaty or something like that, which presumably rules out any kind of big time weaponry being stationed in space, or
does
it's
not
supposed to
allow
prevent Star Wars, but I don't think it has any teeth, does it? What's the matter? Why isn't that stopping everything?
What the Outer Space Treaty prohibits is the placement of a nuclear weapon in orbit around the Earth
Mhm.
or any sort of military activity on the moon and other celestial bodies. There's been, so ICBMs, for example, at the time of the treaty, were agreed to not be considered a violation of the treaty because they pass through outer space, but they are not stationed in space on any sort of permanent basis. And then,
Sorry, these are weapons that were shot off. Where
so
the
these are just missiles.
but they are missiles. They are weapons.
So missiles launched from the ground, say an
Yeah.
ICBM going from one country to another. It's launched and it goes quite high in altitude, so it does reach outer space. And it briefly passes through outer space on its sort of arced trajectory
Yeah.
to another country. But at the time of the treaty, it was agreed that the wording should be placement rather than being in space at any time, so that these intercontinental ballistic missiles could still continue to be an option. There have also been there's been the development of other systems that do spend some time in space. So there are fractional orbital bombardment systems that were tested in the 60s and 70s, where a system can complete a fraction of an orbit around the Earth, evade missile defense systems, and then come down and release a nuclear weapon. Again, because that completes part of an orbit, but not a full orbit, they were allowed because they weren't stationed on a permanent basis. And we've seen those systems being developed again more recently. So China seems to have tested a system like that in 2021, I believe. And, I think it's time that we start talking about, what is in the spirit of the Outer Space Treaty, because the Outer Space Treaty is actually an arms control regime. And I think it can be leveraged more. But I will also say,
tell me about satellites, because being a naive sociologist instead of a scientist,
not at all
to
naive.
me, if they're placing satellites out there and the satellites are to be used for nuclear war, that's a violation of something. It ought to be.
Yeah, I mean, so I think especially the concern that, so I think where this comes in, so these satellites are used in support of nuclear issues. So we rely on satellites for things like early warning, to know when a missile is launched, to track missiles, and to communicate. So for any sort of communication regarding a nuclear launch. And we also use satellites for verification. So a lot arms control treaties, for example, can be verified by Earth observation satellites, which can look at silos, try to understand how many missiles a country has. Are they in compliance with an arms control regime or not? But we're seeing increasing, so I wouldn't say any of those satellites themselves are a violation of the Outer Space Treaty. And in fact, because a lot of them are dual use, so
well, also I've heard that a way of really hurting your enemy would be to use missiles to knock out their satellites. And this would be a great kind of war to run. It would not involve nuclear weapons, I gather, but it doesn't sound like a good thing. And I hate to, it's really important to get rid of nuclear weapons, but they're all part of a larger system of weaponry that it's kind of disentangling. It'd be hard to disentangle what is a legitimate weapon and what is not.
Absolutely.
Even theoretically. Am I wrong?
That's absolutely correct. That's the biggest issue right now in space security, is defining what a space weapon is, because a satellite, any satellite, could be used to go knock into another satellite and destroy it. And so is that a space weapon? But what I will say is, I want to go back to what Stuart was saying a while ago about sort of the possibility of false alarms. And as we increasingly rely on space space-based assets for those alarms, there are a lot of things that could go wrong in space. Not only can you have countries threatening other satellites, but there's large amounts of just junk floating around in not even floating, it's traveling very, very fast. And that could threaten your satellites. That would then be used for these nuclear purposes. And you could have solar storms. So all the beautiful aurora that we've been seeing in these past few months could also end up really affecting the satellites and potentially taking them out. And so
we've had a little conversation about a possible Carrington event where a whole big solar blast comes at the part of the world that's facing the sun. Now, I didn't think in terms of what that would do. It's bad enough that it's going to knock out all of our electric grid, but you're saying that? Are you saying that this would also have an effect on the security system that's space-based?
It would. I think my bigger concern is when we don't know something's going to happen. And with the Carrington event, we would know that a Carrington event has happened. There are, for example, small pieces of debris in orbit that we can't see. They're too small for us to see. And if one of those hits an early warning satellite, are we going to assume that it was debris, or are we going to assume that it was an intentional attempt or an intentional attack on a satellite? And what will that do in terms of a launch on warning posture?
Now I'll go back to Stuart. Is she's been throwing a lot of stuff that it doesn't sound like that is your central the argument that you're trying to make. We've got, by talking about all of these related but not central threats that are connected to nuclear weapons. Does this muddy the water for your project, or is it an essential? Should it be considered an essential part of the work that you're trying to accomplish?
Well, I think what the topics Ruhi raises is not at all muddying the waters. I think it's an important component of it. It is true that even forgetting about outer space, we have this core problem that we have terrestrially based nuclear weapons. So you're right, that is the core problem. But I think in all the ways that Ruhi said, the nuclear weapons that are based here in the land and in the oceans are affected by what we have stationed in outer space. So it's not a distraction, doesn't muddy the waters. It's all part of the larger problem. I had a question for Ruhi. Would the Outer Space Treaty, would it prohibit anti-satellite weapons, and would it prohibit space-based non-nuclear weapons, lasers and directed?
It wouldn't.
Would not.
No.
Well, so I mean, it should. Like the Outer Space Treaty says that outer space is to be used for peaceful purposes for all humankind. But in terms, a lot of these weapons, like anti-satellite weapons, have been phrased or as defensive measures, and not offensive. And so they've come to be accepted as not in violation of the Outer Space Treaty.
Okay. Yeah.
Okay, where are you going with this, Stuart? What you're now expanding beyond the U.S. physics community. Where are you looking for allies?
Well, actually, so the simplest place to expand is into Canada, and we did get some funding from the Simons Foundation in Canada to just directly expand exactly more or less what we're doing in the United States. So actually, with the help of Ruhi and I know Professor Ramana, who you know at UBC, not the help and their guidance, we're reaching out to Canadian universities to go to Canadian universities and give colloquia, have discussions, recruit to our coalition, but also discuss what can be done in Canada. Canada is not a nuclear weapon state, but it's in the Nuclear Alliance. So that's the most straightforward. More complicated than that, though, is how to have an effect in, let's say, the other 8 nuclear weapon states.
Mhm.
That's really difficult. In the majority of those nuclear weapon states, people cannot express their views about nuclear weapons or much anything else. I mean, Russia, China, Pakistan, now India, North Korea, China. You can't have the discussion that we're having today publicly. Israel there's freedom of speech there. People say whatever they want, but not with nuclear weapons. There's some censorship on nuclear weapons discussion in Israel. So you have to put Israel into the category as well. That leaves the UK and France and the United States for the other 3 nuclear weapon states. And I was just told the other day that even in France, you can suffer some professional penalty if you speak up too loudly about the French nuclear weapon policy. So this is where in the U.S. we're kind of special. One, we in the U.S. we still can say anything we want. This is really true. On nuclear weapons, really true.
And would that be true of people working in the nuclear industry if they were so inclined? Nuclear weapons industry.
Well, that I don't know the answer authoritatively, but I would imagine not. I think if someone is employed for a company that's getting a contract, they're not going to. Their company would not give them the freedom to speak. And national laboratories, it's more delicate. I think, strictly speaking, if you're working in one of the 2 to 3 nuclear weapons labs, you can express your opinion as long as you're clear it's your own individual opinion. But I think in practice, it's not so easy. So I think if someone a little more Los Alamos wants to speak, lobby against nuclear weapons or write articles against it, I think it's not so easy. So we're trying to reach out, and then also we find that there's no analog to our Physicists Coalition in other countries. So we're trying to work from the bottom up and plant some seeds and work with our colleagues elsewhere to see where we can go. And
well, I've been a long time member of the Pugwash.
Yes.
And, in the day, they were mostly physicists, I suppose. The founders certainly were, but it's not true anymore.
Right.
And I don't know whether there's any ability to do anything cooperatively with Pugwash. Have you thought?
We will actually, oh, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
No, that's
I was going to say that the Physicists Coalition will be participating in the Canadian Pugwash meeting in October.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, I don't know about the US Pugwash.
It's attenuated greatly from what it was when it was most productive. It still exists. And in fact, we had this international workshop in Italy. We had 50 people, 20 nations, and there was a meeting of the Pugwash, whatever it was, Pugwash Council at the same place, co-located. So we had some discussion with them, but Pugwash isn't as strong as it used to be. So it's yeah.
And it's not as physicist based either.
Right. But, yeah.
So what's your game plan?
Well, so there's two parts to that question. One is what the coalition can do, and then the other one is what the arms control community can do. So in terms of what the coalition can do, we're going to keep plugging away. I mean, we're only 4 years old, so we're still fledgling, I would say. So we're most definitely going to keep charging in terms of trying to recruit physical scientists, not just physicists. We're open to astronomers, climate scientists, physical scientists to our coalition. And we're going to keep improving our lobbying. As Ruhi said, we had the first lobbying event where we brought 35 coalition members to DC for 2 to 3 days, and we lobbied in 53 different congressional offices. And prior to that, our lobbying has been mostly through we do alerts, we do campaigns, but it hasn't been physically in DC. We have people contact their representatives by email, by Zoom meeting, or by however they want to do it. So we're going to keep charging and try to improve our lobbying ability. We want to try new things, like really trying to challenge the physics community, as I mentioned, and particularly in the ethics of what it means to work on nuclear weapons. That hasn't been done. That was a big thing in the advent of the nuclear era, of course. I mean, the physics greats of the 20th centuries struggled with these issues. But since the end of the Cold War, we don't have that. But then we're also trying to push the arms control community to think more broadly what the arms control community can do, because if you just roll forward where we are today in the arms control community to 10 years into the future, probably the situation will be worse, because we're at the beginning, as you know, of a new arms race.
And yeah. Okay, I get it.
Yeah.
Okay, look, I'm trying to think in terms of what I can do. And my job, I see it, has always been to try to influence public opinion about these issues more generally, because I think unless you get public opinion, you're not going to get the political support. I mean, all your lobbying may be in vain, but if you do get the public concerned or renew concern on the part of the public, because there certainly used to be, then there's some help. Now, briefly, I mentioned the idea of bringing people together. I do these forums every so often. I used to do them 5 days a week, but I'm getting old. And I can't do it that much. But I could do more, and we could systematically have a series of conversations, let's say, in which if you would participate in this, let's find people, physicists in other countries, physicists of any list that you want to put together that you think could make an interesting conversation such as we're having now, because I find this very interesting. We could have forum conversations like this one that then we will try to publicize generally to the general public. We do send out notices and peace magazines which contain publicity to something like 20,000 computers around the world every time we publish a new issue. So we could do more publicity and we could do more forums that would be public, but it would be a combination of physicists talking physics lingo, and that's always my biggest challenge, to bring together scientists who want to talk to each other about their scientific concerns, but we need to have it in plain English for the general reader. Would that be of any value to include you both in a regular consultation for finding people that we could set up every few weeks, a discussion like this in which you would invite your friends in the scientific community elsewhere?
I think that would be fantastic. And one thing I would just add is having early career voices in that, I think would be really valuable. So I really appreciate being included here, but also I think for early career physicists to learn that they can talk about these issues, I think that was a big jump for me, was finding the confidence to speak about these issues as someone who's not a nuclear physicist, but knowing that, yes, I actually understand this well enough, but also any member of the general public should be able to talk about and advocate on these issues, because these are ultimately issues that affect all of us. And I think, especially as an early career physicist, you're not often supported in doing that. There's kind of still this academic culture, like Stuart mentioned, of you do your research. And I think that's changing. But
you have your network of early career scientists. I have no such list. The value of our cooperating would be, at the present arrangement I do with the shows I'm doing right now, every show has its own page in our website, which includes not only the video that will be edited, but also the audio podcast so people can listen in their cars, and also a place where there's a room for comments. And people can comment on that show, which will go into a general discussion page about war and weapons, all of those pages would be together. So you could you could try to publicize this, or send me your list of young career scientists, and Stuart could
the next
send whatever
generation
list he has, or I could send you the material, the URLs, and you could distribute it yourself. But the idea is to contribute and add to the list of people receiving this information, and it would be certainly physicists, but you've got this coalition already has its own list. But now the point is, how much of that would be of interest to the general public? Naturally, if you're talking about the technology, all the scientific things, there are certain conversations that you're going to have that would be totally baffling to the general public. So not everything you publish or publicize on your own could be put up. But our conversations, like this one, could be, or you could even create your own. You don't need me, as long as you have a conversation oriented toward the general public in which you're talking plain English. Would Stuart, tell me, does that resonate?
Yes, I agree with Ruhi. Yes, I mean, I think because you bring this discussion to a different audience than our coalition does, surely. I mean, there are lots of webinars within the arms control community in the U.S. They have webinars, but I think you bring it to a different spectrum of people. So I think that would be great.
If I pursue this, and I think I will, can I call on you and we can work together on making this happen?
Yes.
If you're seriously interested in it. If not, that's all right. But
no.
Okay.
Sounds like good.
I should say I'm moving to a new position in mid-October. That's a little more of a public-facing role.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. It's been fun. Project Save the World produces these forums, and this is episode 626. Watch them or listen to them as audio podcasts on our website, tosavetheworld.ca. People share information there about 6 global issues, and we welcome your comments too. To find a particular talk show, check the scroll list on the homepage or use the search bar. Project Save the World also produces a quarterly online publication, Peace Magazine, which now serves as a free-of-charge newsletter to help mobilize knowledge about 6 global threats to humankind. We currently email the magazine as a PDF or a link to any interested organization in the world that works to prevent a global catastrophe involving war and weapons, global warming, famine, pandemics, radioactive contamination, or cyber risks. Just email us at office@peacemagazine.org and we'll add your group's email address without charge to our list. For individual subscriptions at $20 Canadian per year, go to pressreader.com on your browser and search for Peace Magazine.